welcome to our panel. We were already introduced, but I'm going to have each of you talk a bit about who you are, what you do, and where. And this whole session is about how public sector information governance may differ from, and including education and government, may differ from other contexts. So we'll start with Mara.
Hi, good morning. I'm Mara Hermano. I'm the Vice President for Integrated Planning at Rhode Island School of Design, just a few blocks away. And my portfolio includes accreditation, institutional research, student learning outcome assessment, and I think that's enough. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then we'll go to Joel.
Good morning, everyone, again. My name is Joel Westphal. I'm the director of the Navy Archives. I'm responsible for one of the largest records repositories outside of the National Archives at College Park and the other federal record centers. My primary goal is to preserve naval history.
Good morning. I am Mansur Hasib. I'm the program chair for the Graduate Cybersecurity Technology Program at the University of Maryland University College. We have 93,000 students, of whom 12,000 are in cybersecurity, 6,000 undergraduates and 6,000 graduate students. And we have about 371 faculty members teaching cybersecurity. That's going to increase to about 400. So essentially we have the world's largest cybersecurity education program, and I'm very thrilled to be part of that and very happy to be here.
Okay, well, welcome. Excuse me while I stand up here. So my name's Kevin Parker, and I do some consulting with the federal government. I have for the past about 6 years, do some work with Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, Department of Justice. And the company that I work for is a solutions integrator, but we do everything from strategy, architecture, and governance to actual implementation. So that's why the four of us have been asked to be part of this group. So I'll be asking the questions, though. Let's start in the same order that we started with just now. Give me just a little bit about what information governance is for you in your context and how it might be unique to your context as opposed to maybe in the private sector. So we'll start with Mara.
So disclaimer, the term and the field information governance is actually very new to me. It's not a term I'd heard until I met Nick Inglis.
Okay.
And I said, what's information governance? And he said, it's what you do. It's like, okay. So I think in terms of, for institutions of higher education, there is a call to use more data for decision making. There's also a focus due to the high student loan debt and low completion rates. There's a focus on transparency and accountability from the federal government, particularly for those institutions that receive federal financial aid, and a call for transparency on the part of higher education institutions to tell consumers, our prospective parents and students, about the cost of higher education, the completion rates, the career outcomes of our students. So I'm coming at it from that perspective.
Okay. Joel?
For me, information governance from a federal employee, federal government standpoint is all about reducing risk. That's why when I look at information governance, I look at it from the perspective, it's records management, it's Freedom of Information Act, and it's privacy. Those are the core kind of ingredients for me as an information governance. I don't call myself an information governance professional, but if I was to be an information governance officer within the federal government, and in my speech, there's only a couple right now within the Fed, it's really about taking those branches, FOIA department, privacy department, records department, and putting them in a holistic environment where they can work and collaborate together to reduce risk for the agency and the department.
Okay, Mansur?
I view governance in the cybersecurity context as well as the business decision-making context, because I believe that today enterprise governance, enterprise strategy, business strategy, cybersecurity strategy all have come together. And governance to me is also a way of making decisions, having established guidelines for making decisions. For example, if you look at the Target breach, the issue was that there was no governance. They had information, but they didn't know what to do with it. They didn't know who was supposed to make a decision on it. So governance gives you that framework for establishing who has authority over what, who can make what those decisions are, and basically just rules of engagement. But often a lot of people view governance as control. I view it as leadership, because you have to engage everybody in this cycle of innovation, because without innovation, you can never have cybersecurity. So I feel like governance needs to be a structure that provides decision-making, but also provides for innovation. So it's a very, very fascinating topic to me.
So this is the second time I've heard the Target breach mentioned today. I was one of the victims of that. Probably some of you were.
Oh, I was too, yeah.
Hundreds of dollars, you know, all of a sudden charged to my account. Thankfully, that's been resolved. But I was also one of everybody in the federal government that was the OPM breach. So that's, yeah. If you've done any business with the federal government, I think since the 80s, you were part of that breach, even though you may not have been notified yet. But not pointing any fingers at that. But
I was a former OPM employee, so you be careful.
Okay, duly noted. So let's talk a bit about, you know, a lot of the folks here work in the legal profession, or they work in private sector information governance. Really, what do you see as different about public sector versus private sector? Is it different constituencies? Is it different, just who you're dealing with compared to somebody that's doing a for-profit business? Do you see a difference, or is it all part of the same leadership? We'll start this direction, Mansur.
Personally, I don't see a difference, because everything, so once again, I help people understand that if you're going to do governance, cybersecurity, whatever it is that you do, you got to focus on the mission. So the difference would only be the mission. Other than that, the procedures, the policies, the way you do it is all going to be the same. I mean, it has to be adaptable to that. So a governance strategy in one organization should work in a different organization, but you still have to adapt it to the mission. So what would be different is the mission, the focus. The risks would sometimes be different also, because, for example, an organization that doesn't deal with, say, HIPAA-protected records, well, doesn't have that risk. So the risk calculations are going to be different. So that's the difference.
Okay. So different regulation, maybe, but different mission is really
you may be under different regulations, and you may be handling different data, so you've got to be conscious about that. What is your mission? What is your risk? And then, therefore, tailor your governance strategy and leadership strategy to that.
Okay. Joel?
I partially agree. However, I think it's really more about culture. The difference between the cultures of the public and the private sector. They're inherently different. You know, the private sector is geared for making a profit, whereas opposed the public sector is not. So that in its core concept is a big, you know, diametrically kind of opposed culture. But when you look at it from how can we establish information governance structures, I agree with the comment about the mission, and every mission is different, whether it's in the public sector or in the private sector. Mm-hmm. You know, one department's mission, for example, Homeland Security, is certainly different than the Department of Labor, and each of those different departments have a different culture. And it's for me, that's kind of the difference between the public and the private sector.
Okay, Mara?
I think my institution is private and not for profit. And I think most educational institutions are beginning to look at the business and governance practices of the private for-profit sector to learn how to use this information, how to manage this information better. I agree with, you know, both the mission and the culture, and then I think about, for us, our customer is our students.
Right.
So there's an added layer of privacy and compliance when we think about the FERPA standards that we have to use to govern student information and student data.
Right, so I think in all of our contexts, and I also worked in education for a while before I did government consulting, and in both areas, both arenas, I saw not only are you dealing with your internal folks, but you have customers that are your students or your citizens or whatever whatever your agency or education institution does, you've got customers just like the private sector has customers. It's a different nature of customer, but you still have the same issues, but maybe even more regulations in some contexts, right? So, all right.
One comment I would like to make, drawing on Joel's point about the culture, I sincerely believe that governance's focus is the development of the right culture that
I completely agree.
That actually fosters this proper safety of data. So that was a very, very good point that you made.
I agree.
Do we want to talk a bit more about culture? Some tips maybe for the audience?
Yeah, I think, so in my view, one of the things I know how culture is developed is there are 4 elements. You have to have values. In other words, something must be valued. Without values, you can never have culture. You gotta have rituals, and which is reinforcing that culture and the behavior that you want. You gotta have heroes. You celebrate and we reward people that are living the culture. And then you gotta have a social network that prevents deviation. So those are the 4 elements of culture that I'm aware of.
I really can't add too much more to that. From a federal perspective, there's different cultures in different organizations scattered throughout the Fed. You know, the culture where I was in at OPM was certainly different than the culture from the U.S. Central Command, where you have a military. Basically, you're a federal civilian, but you're working alongside the military on a day-to-day basis in operations, where you can have a senior leader come in, you know, a 4-star general who simply can say, you know, I'm taking this and putting it over here and moving this and over here, and as opposed to where the director of OPM has a union to work with, and any changes in the org, it has to be ratified through the union. So there are different cultures within the federal government that can either help or hinder improvement and creating governance structures throughout the organization.
But do you feel that, I think the desire to implement the governance structure often precedes, like, what comes first? In order, you need to have both, and they're not usually operating at the same kind of speed. You need to build the structure first and then get the culture to follow along, or how do you?
The structures are within the Fed. I mean, the structures are already there. I mean, all federal agencies have a privacy department, a FOIA department, a records management department, but they oftentimes can be scattered throughout, and they're not talking to each other. Yes. And for me, as as someone who is trying to influence an information and governance structure within the Fed, and that's what my talk today was about, is how do we break down those barriers? How do you influence a senior leader within the federal government to take a look at this concept and go, well, that's something that can really reduce risk within the agencies. It's really about trying to get the OMB, who created Klinger-Cohen back in 1996, who created the federal CIOs, created CIOs within the federal government. And we need a new Klinger-Cohen that talks about information governance as a core concept, very similar to how Klinger-Cohen back 20 years ago created the CIO concept within the Fed.
And there's no shortage of regulation, right? Especially in the federal space, but really that influences everything that everybody at this conference does, right? But it's specifically in the federal government, the newly updated OMB Circular A130, yes. For instance, now they've changed the wording so that it's really about managing information as a strategic asset, right? Which is so much about information governance and how you implement those things. Let's talk very briefly, and again, we realize you can't share a ton of detail, especially with the Navy archives, but perhaps one story that you can share with our audience about something that's working very well in terms of how you manage and govern information in your context. We'll start with Maura.
We are a long way away from, I think, even the level of discussion that you're having at this conference. I think I can speak more about the challenges, but generally in the landscape of higher education, I think there's more collaboration. There's a better understanding of using data to actually support student learning, which is our mission and our goal as institutions of higher education. And institutions are using the research through learning analytics and learning sciences to really kind of create a whole package of how to use the information we are collecting to support our missions.
So before we move to Joel, that's, I think, a great point to really hit home here, is that it's not just about controlling and restricting access to information, right? If we're talking about information strategy and governance, it's got to be about how do you use information to benefit your organization and your constituents, right? So student data, data to help students do their work better, right?
To ensure that they're succeeding, that they're successful in their courses, that they're completing their education.
Okay, very good.
So I really can't talk too much about the archives, but I will talk about my previous job as the Director of Records for the Department of the Navy. Following the 2015 Information Governance Conference, I was handed a gift from the heavens, which was someone from what we call the Sea Warrior program in the project management workshop of the Department of the Navy had received a contract whereby they were taking things, certain trainings, and going mobile. And I looked upon this as an improvement for governance. How can we get governance improved in the Department of the Navy? And I was asked, do you want to be part of this? And I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, I would love to be part of this, and this is what we're going to do. We're going to create a records management training mobile application. And it's the very first of its kind in the public or private sector. Anyone can utilize it. Even the public sector can go and download it from the Android, or their Android or their iOS. Go to the Apple Store. It's the first of its kind, and it's kind of going more towards that information governance, more of a training aspect. How do you do records management within the Department of the Navy? It only speaks towards records management within the Department of the Navy, but it goes towards influencing the information governance structures that others can take a look at, and going mobile. And again, you spoke about innovation. It's innovative. How we train going into the future is going to be different than currently how we train now. You actually teach not in a classroom. That is the future for training in a lot of the concepts within the federal government. We have a lot of federal employees who now telework, or for example, in the Department of the Navy, they're on board a ship in the middle of wherever that need access to this type of training. And how do they get it? Mobile solutions and innovation are required, and that is part of the information governance.
Yeah, so let me try to draw upon my experiences at various organizations, and one of the points that Mara made, which was the organizational structure. Actually, the key with this working right is what I call strategic leadership collaboration. So, because you cannot have information silos, because then what that will do is make your decisions tunnel visioned or jaundiced. You won't have a complete picture. So you gotta have that strategic leadership collaboration. So some organizations do that very well, some don't, okay? Yeah. And so the organizational structure sometimes can be devastating for the strategic leadership collaboration. In some of my early experiences, I saw that it was always about people. As Joel said, Mara said, it's really about people, because sometimes you see the organizational structure working against you. But you see, if you are a leader and you truly want to work on behalf of the organization, you gotta look past the organizational structure and say, I'm gonna collaborate, I'm gonna do the right thing for the organization. When I was at the nuclear power plant, that's kind of what we did. We were trying to build an enterprise network, but different people had different authority over different things. And we saw that the organizational culture was still not there because it was still mainframe-oriented, silo. So to break that, the leaders of each organizations, we decided we're going to sit at lunch at the cafeteria, start hashing out and overcoming the organizational boundaries. So that is the key, I think, in getting that complete information picture. and then making the right decisions.
Very good. So let's talk a little bit about challenges now. Those are some of the successes. Those are some things we're doing well. What about maybe one or two challenges that you recognize in your context? And I'll just let it be a free-for-all here.
Legacy data.
Okay.
Running an archive, it's always about legacy data. We still have information that are on 3.5s, 5 1/4s. We have paper that needs to turn into digital because we get so much use out of it, and we want to have more records that have electronic content so we can quickly find them. It's difficult to troll through boxes when we have FOIAs to find that information within a box as opposed to find that information in a digital format. So really it's about legacy data. That's our biggest challenge.
I think moving from the manual processes, especially in higher ed, to the digital environment, but also the infrastructure. For a lot of institutions, we're using an enterprise system that's about 30 years old. And how are we getting access to more data faster when we are challenged exactly by those kind of departmental silos? To use data strategically, we have to be able to look across all the information. In my context, whether it's enrollment information, registrar information, and our finance information, to look across all of that to make those decisions. So, and higher ed, we survive a lot on fundraising. I can't fundraise for an enterprise system. It's not sexy. Scholarships and professorships are better, more attractive to potential donors. So the infrastructure can't support our aspirations.
The biggest challenge that I've seen is that people have a wrong view of leadership. And the fact that every one of us can be a leader, regardless of their position, because many people identify leadership with a position. They think if you're on a pedestal and you have some title and authority, that makes you a leader, and so therefore they're waiting for cues. Except in order to do this properly, because ultimately the governance, cybersecurity, all of this depends on the behavior of every individual, and because every individual has to do micro-innovation. In other words, can I do my job better? How can I do my job better? Everybody has to be thinking about that. So what we do try to fix that is in our curriculum, in our discussions. That's what we try to free people. That, look, position does not determine whether you're going to be a leader or not. Your mental state determines whether you can choose to be a leader. So let's help you refine your leadership capabilities. So that's what we have been doing. That's what I personally have been doing. That's why my passion is also this whole leadership concept.
I would say, though, I totally agree with you. That's been my experience in my career. Is most of my career I haven't been in charge of a ton of people, but I still had to bring these issues up with, in the colleges that I've worked at, the universities, and the government, and even private sector. Hey, we have these issues, we have these silos, we have this legacy stuff that we've got to deal with. Somebody needs to deal with it. So, yes, that takes a different skill set often than the technical things that we talk about sometimes at these conferences, but you have to be able to sell that to someone who is in a positional authority at least, so that you can then get the funding that, like you mentioned. So let's talk about that just for a bit. So are you saying that going out and asking for money for information governance might not be great? Say, hey, I want to start this new IG program, although we can't say that in the federal space because IG has a whole different meaning. Inspector General, for those of you that yeah, that's definitely an established role that's different. We're not going to mix acronyms there. But so what would you call it if not information governance in your context?
I think that
fundraising here.
I think that the idea, whatever it is that you're trying to do, has to be tied to the mission, and has to be, how are we enhancing the mission by doing this? How does it connect? Is it saving me some money? Is it gaining me some money? And risk, a lot of people view risk as negative, but risk is positive and negative. So you can have a positive risk also. So you've got to
it can become an opportunity, right?
Exactly.
And not just be a risk.
Exactly. So you've got to be able to translate everything that you do, everything that you propose in that higher level business terms. If you do that, I think you'll be successful.
So maybe throw out a term like cybersecurity. I know that was...
I never used that kind of word.
I heard you mention that, though.
Yeah.
Like, that's maybe not the way everyone defines it, but if that is something that's hot on someone's agenda, then talking about cybersecurity could help you. I would say the same thing for digital transformation. I see that term thrown around a lot these days. But if that's something that's already an imperative at your organization, certainly define it in terms of digital transformation. But if it's not, then maybe that term would fall flat. So you've got to tie it to the mission. I completely see that.
To give you a simple example, in the healthcare sector, when I was CIO there, health safety and the safety of the patient was a culture. They valued that. So I never used the word cybersecurity. I said data safety. Tied it to the patient safety. Everybody got it.
So tie it to the mission.
Tie it to the mission.
Tie it to the strategic goals of your organization.
Exactly.
Okay.
Tie it to the language that is prevalent in the organization.
I would say, from my experience, that definitely will help you win a business case in terms of the people that have the funding, more than just using the terms that we use. I think it's important for us to come up with the right terms, but that doesn't mean that our organization is going to get those. So tie it to mission, strategy, and the vision of your organization.
In the Fed, and this, again, part of what I talked about earlier, there's only currently one information governance officer within the Fed, within the Fed. But there are other entities within the Fed that do kind of that holistic FOIA, privacy records management. They call them, you know, whether they call them, you know, the information manager. It can be the information manager. For example, FEMA has a brand new director of information management, which is over FOIA, records management, and privacy. They don't call it the information governance officer, but in my opinion, that is the information governance officer, because that person is in charge of those core concepts, and they're all working collaboratively together within that framework. And it's about establishing framework, whether you call it an information governance framework or an information management framework or some other type of governance framework. It's about making sure that what you mentioned earlier is removing the silos. You have to remove those silos, and that's really the key component.
So what is one takeaway, and I'll give each of you a chance to mention one takeaway for today's audience that you think that from today's session would benefit them if they're working in public sector or private sector, or either one? One important takeaway.
I would recommend that you create either data safety champions or information governance champions. It doesn't matter what you call them, but you have to have it throughout your entire organization. So when I was implementing a network at the nuclear power plant, we had 2,500 people there. How do I implement a new culture around new everything? The way I did it was by creating 100, what we used to call them at that time, information technology coordinators, but today we would probably call them something else. But you have to have that network. These are not IT people, they're business people embedded in the unit. It's like a political organization, so to speak.
Very good.
Innovation. For me, it's all about the word innovation. If you're not innovating, you're not moving your agency or you're not moving your company forward. You're either staying exactly where you are, and therefore you're not, improving your profit, or you're improving or you're reducing your risks. It's really about working with senior leaders, managers, leadership concepts, and innovating on a constant basis. Always on a constant basis, innovate.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
And I think my takeaway is really based on both the culture and innovation. We can't achieve any of those without really a collaborative structure that helps us look across our departmental or institutional silos, so that IT is working with, institutional research to make sure we're backing each other up, and we're building the right structures together to support the goals of the institution.
Very good. Well, we're out of time. Thank our panelists with me. Thank you very much, panelists.
Thank you.